Okay, hello and welcome to training class. We are going to go over how to fill out the offer to purchase 2T form today. So we're going to use Dotloop here and actually walk through the form step by step and fill in the blanks as we go. All right, so this class is really just to go over what goes in each blank. There is hours and hours of work we can do on how to present the offer, how to negotiate the offer, how to use pieces of this contract in a negotiation. And we'll touch on a little bit of that, but really the purpose of the class is just to go over how to fill out the form itself. So I would highly recommend you go ahead and grab a blank offer to purchase. Maybe fill it out as we go. That'd be a good way to learn along with me. And other than that, hopefully it's a good guide for you to kind of come back and forth to over time and have a good reference. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Like we talked about in the other class on filling out agency agreements, the names on the contracts are very important. But this time, this is between the buyer and seller and not between the company or the firm and the client. So now we got to be really particularly careful about what we're putting in here. From the seller side, it's always, everybody involved in the purchase. So if they're married, both people need to sign. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Unless they have a power of attorney signed, both people always have to sign. The situations that I've seen that come up are a seller has said we're separated, we've been separated for 20, 30 years. Does she still need to sign? Yep, she still needs to sign. So anytime there's one of those divorce situations involved or separations, don't take their word for it unless everybody's signing. That's always fine. But if not, then you need to get with the divorce attorney and make sure you have all that set. Okay. So that's always important. That's the one issue I've seen come up quite a bit. All right. Also on estates and things like that, it could be whatever estate um, gets put into here. How should you word that estate? Talk to the estate attorney. How they want it worded is what we should put in there. Okay. But let's just say it's a quote unquote normal contract here, and so we would maybe put, computer's lagging a little bit here. We might go Joe and Susan Smith, something like that. So that would be for the seller. Sometimes people put Joe Smith and Susan Smith. That would be okay as well. Um, but you don't. In the past, we used to put like Joe Smith husband and Susan Smith wife. Like you don't have to do that. Okay. It's a preference of some people, but you don't have to do it that way. All right, the buyer, same thing. It's the actual buyers that we're going to want on the deed. So let's say that's Sally and Sam Jones. All right, something like that, right? So Sally and Sam Jones could be the buyer, could be the LLC or anything like that. Again, it could be just Sally Jones or it could be just Sam Jones. It doesn't need to be both on the buyer side, just on the seller side. Okay, so that's pretty simple, right? Now, again, just like we talked about on the listing agreement, it is very important that we identify the property correctly, and we always need to have at least three ways to identify the property. Okay, so the first way is typically always the address. So let's say it's 123 Main Street, 123 Main Street, and let's just say that is in Asheville. Say 28805. Oops. 28805, and then the county. All right, so that's one way to identify the property. So we need two other ways. So the second way might be the PIN number, right? So let's say the PIN is 9654 111 1524, something like that. So that may be the PIN. And then we always have the deed book and page as well. So let's say it's 123 4567. Oops. 4567. Okay, so that's 3 ways to identify the property. So that's typically good. You don't have to have the plats and plat book pages in here. If you have them as part of the identifying marks of the property, put them in there. But if you don't find them, which on a lot of properties in Western North Carolina, we won't have those, you don't have to put that in there. Okay, so just make sure you have 3 different ways to identify the property. Now the trick comes in the different situations that we have. So you might have this house at 123 Main Street, and there's also another lot right next door to it that goes with it. So you might have to say lot to the left of the house of 0.25 acres goes with the sale as well. Something like that. Okay. And I mean, there's a million different options that could come up. But that may be the case. In that case, we would also need to put the other PIN number in here, because if they are a separate lot, it will have another PIN number and another deed book and page, typically another deed book and page. So we might say this is 959456 111 2345, something like that, right? So you just add those extra pins in there. Okay. But it's really important that you always identify the property as closely as possible. Another thing that can come up is maybe somebody's selling a house that has 30 acres, but they're only selling the house with 1 acre. Same thing, you have to put just the house with the approximate 1 acre of land, see Addenda A, and then Addenda A could be a survey, would be great, would be ideal, or it could be just a GIS map where the seller, not you, but the seller draws an approximate line of where the boundary lines will be surveyed out before this closes, and buyer and seller initial on that as well. All right, so there's a lot of other different things that come up, but basically that's what you need to know, that you need to clearly identify the property on the 2T. Okay? All right, moving on. Purchase price. Well, that's the actual total purchase price that we're offering on the property. Okay, let's just say for this deal, it's $380,000 that they're going to be offering. The due diligence fee goes here, and again, that's the money that is non-refundable. Let's just say in this case they're offering $500 due diligence fee. How much do we put in there? That's for a different class, really, but it's negotiable. It could be up to $380,000. Okay, I wouldn't recommend putting $380,000 in there for due diligence fee, but it could be, and that's what I want us to always talk to our clients about, that you have the options to do these things. But let's just say in this case they're offering $500 there, and maybe they're offering $2,500 in earnest money, right? So something like that. That's where those would go. These are always missed or often missed in the contract. So make sure you're checking these off correctly. It's a personal check that they're using, and then we'll have that within 5 days. All right, so make sure we're checking these off. Additional earnest money. It's not used that often, but it can be used. And if somebody was going to offer additional earnest money, you'd want to put that right there. Okay, you don't necessarily have to put 0 in there. It's good if you want to do that, just to make it a little more clear on the offer. An assumption just doesn't happen that often, but if we're using an assumption, we would put that money in there. Building deposit money goes here. Seller financing would go here. So let's see, get that in there. All right. So seller financing, if they're offering that, if that's been agreed to by buyer and seller, or we're making the offer, asking for it, how much would that be? So let's say the buyer's going to put down, to make it easy, $300,000, right? And then they're going to ask for the seller to take back $80,000 in seller financing. You put $80,000 right there. And then you use the seller financing addendum to go over the other terms of that loan. Okay, so that's where that would go right there. All right. And then the balance. This is another thing I see that agents just forget about sometimes. So make sure the balance is here. The balance is your purchase price minus everything else here. Right? I think it would actually help if I was on the forms committee. I would ask them to put a line right here so it just looks more like addition and just say purchase price and then minus blank, 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 and then here's your total. Okay, but that's what we're looking to do. So be in this case it'd be 380,000 minus $3,000, right? So we put in there $377,000 would be our balance. All right, that's pretty much it. Buyers and sellers initial, bottom of each page. All right, moving on. Earnest money deposit, escrow agent. Who's the escrow agent? If you're filling out this offer to purchase with your buyer and they don't know who they're using for an attorney, well, now is a great time to find out which attorney we're going to use. Let's have that discussion right now. Which attorney are we going to use? Okay, that's who we want to go in there. We don't, as you know from our company policy, we don't want to take earnest money as a real estate firm. We can and we have the account to do that, but we really, really, really don't want to do it for liability reasons, but also just logistically, it's so much easier to have the buyer's attorney hold the earnest money. That way, it's already there for closing. You don't have to worry about getting the check cut, getting the right amount, picking up the check, bringing it to the closing attorney. Why not just have it to the closing attorney the whole time? Okay. So that's why we typically like to do that. So whatever closing attorney we're using, um, let's just say in this case we're using Philip Price Law Firm. That's what we would put in there like that. Okay. Philip Price Law Firm, or it could be Guzman Rose, Colvert and Kramer Law Firm, could be Joel Weaver Law Firm, could be whatever. But that's typically what we want in there is whatever the law firm that is going to represent the buyer, not the seller, but the buyer. Okay. All right. Oh, and why the buyer, not the seller? Well, because the buyer's attorney is the one that collects all the monies and disperses them, so they're the ones that need the check. So why not just give it to them? All right. Due diligence period. I want a date in here. Okay. You should put a date. The way this reads is the period beginning of the effective date and extending through 5 p.m. on. It reads like a date supposed to be there. And that's what I want you to do. So let's just say we're going to do due diligence period on May 8th. Okay. Again, negotiations on how long that should be, totally dependent on the situation. It could be 0 days, it could be the whole length of the deal. That's a whole other conversation. But I prefer a date in there. Sometimes agents like to put 21 days from effective date or things like that. It's not wrong, it's not illegal. You can do that, and there's a time maybe when that's a good way to think about it. But the problem with that is that I have found is like, well, when's the effective date? Well, it's legally when the last person has signed the contract. Okay, well, so and so thinks it was signed today, and somebody else thinks it was signed yesterday, and then all of a sudden we're working on different dates. And maybe you have one initial here, one initial over here that wasn't dated, and they're arguing it was this date. It just creates headaches sometimes. So to avoid all of that, just use an actual date. There can be no negotiation about that. It's right there. It's 5/8/2020. There's no way around it. As opposed to putting whatever, how many days that would be, 18 days from now, whatever it is. So that's why I don't like doing that. There are some instructors that teach that. Again, it's not wrong. It creates more headaches than it's worth to me. All right. So I want you putting a date in there. All right. Same thing with settlement date. Let's put a date in there as well. Now you notice it's not time is of the essence there, right? So let's say we're just closing this, whatever, May 29th. Okay. So again, I prefer a date in there if at all possible. All right. Moving right along. We've got our closing in here, your instructions in here. Go over this stuff with your buyers and your sellers. Make sure they understand what the fixtures are. Don't just skip over it. I'm kind of skipping over it right now because we're just trying to go over the contract, but make sure you're going through this stuff with your buyers and your sellers so they have a good understanding of what should be going with the property. Okay, don't just assume that they know. Don't just hand them the form and say, yeah, everything in here is applying to you, and they're like, okay, they're not going to read it. So go over it with them. Make sure that you're on the same page. Okay. All right. Page 4, items leased and not owned. Usually the buyer agent is the one filling this out typically. So you might be like, well, hey, I don't know what items are not they're leased or not owned. Now it is in the MLS, but let's just say you still don't know, or you're still wondering if there's something else. Well, no worries. You just fill this out by putting in none. This little blank opens up and you just write in none if there is nothing. And then that way, the seller, when they initial this contract, it's their agreement to the none. So if there is something else in there, it's up to them to counter that to you and go ahead and get that written into the contract. So don't worry if you don't have all the answers from the seller side. Just put what you would want or what your buyer would want the answer to be. And then by the seller signing this contract, then they're agreeing to that as well. All right. So any items that don't convey, same deal. Maybe there is something. You put that in there if there is. Typically, there's not. And what would that be? Items that don't convey. Well, maybe there is that chandelier, or the generator that's attached to the property that they have said they don't want to leave that. Something like that. Okay. Personal property. So here's where you would put in the refrigerators, washers, dryers, anything like that. Boy, excuse me. All right, personal properties where you put refrigerators, washers, and dryers, something like that. Let's say we're asking for the refrigerator here, the washer and dryer. Okay, you can put that in there. Now, if it's the whole house, maybe it's everything in the house, all the furniture, that's another deal. We have a contract written up by an attorney that's in dotloop that addresses all the personal property. And so take a look at that document, and you'd want to document that with itemized lists and pictures and video of the properties to make sure that everything in the property is in fact staying. Okay, but typically personal property, refrigerator, washer, dryer, maybe it's uh, patio furniture. Type that in there, something like that. Okay. All right, moving on. Page 5. Here's where we have the representations. Now, it's important to note this says buyer representations. Buyer representations. So this is not a term of the contract, and there is a huge difference. I know some of our agents were telling me their client thinks, well, I need that loan contingency. Well, there is no loan contingency in this form anymore. It's all part of due diligence, right? So this is not a term of the contract. It's not a contingency for the buyer. It's just a representation so that the seller gets to understand what kind of loan is this buyer getting, because it makes a difference, right? If the buyer was paying cash, they do not intend to obtain a new loan. Maybe they check that off. Or if they are getting a new loan, maybe they're going to do a USDA loan. For a USDA loan, you would check that box there and fill in USDA like that. Makes a difference, right, to the seller. It's USDA's got a few more hurdles to go through than a cash deal. Maybe shows a little bit of the buying power of the buyer, so it can make a difference to the seller, but it's not a term. So the difference is this. Let's say the buyer fills this out and fills in USDA loan. They're going to do a fixed rate for the principal amount. Typically, USDA is the full amount. So let's just say in this case, it's for $380,000 for a term of 30 years, rate not to exceed, I don't know, let's just say 4.5%, something like that right now. All right. And then, so this is how we fill it out, and it all gets signed. But then later during the due diligence period, the lender is talking with the buyer and says, you know what, you'd really do better off doing an FHA loan, or we'd really be better off doing a conventional loan. The buyer's like, okay, yeah, let's just do a conventional loan. You don't have to have the seller sign off on this that you're making the change. You need to let them know if there's any issues that will affect closing. But just because you're switching from a USDA loan to a conventional loan, it's not a way for them to get out of the contract. Okay. So it's just important for you to note that to them that this is a representation. It doesn't mean they have to do this kind of loan. It's important that you let your sellers know this as well, because sometimes sellers get kind of ticked off when the buyer is saying they're doing a conventional loan, and then all of a sudden they're switching to an FHA loan halfway through the deal. Um, I get it. I get why they'd be upset by that, but there's really not much we can do from the seller side. Okay, so just it's important to note that. But that's how you'd fill that out. Just filling out the representations of what they're planning on doing. Another thing I like to note here is when the buyer is saying they're going to do a cash deal and they say does not intend to obtain a loan, and then later they end up getting a loan. It's the same thing. It's not, they don't have to. Now the problem is some investors, well, I shouldn't say that, but some buyers sometimes will lie on the form and say we're gonna, oh yeah, we're gonna pay cash, we're gonna pay cash, and then turns out they're planning on doing a loan all along. That would be a breach of contract. All right, now talk to your attorney, make sure you know on all the legalese of that, but basically that's lying on the form if that's not your plan, because this is what you're representing that you're planning to do. So if you get the hint, the feeling from your buyer that yeah, they're not doing cash, they're doing a loan, but they're telling you to put this is a cash offer on here, that you cannot do. All right, you'd have to have a conversation with them about that and make sure they understand that they can't lie on the form. If they decide to change their mind later, that's fine, but they cannot lie on the form. Okay. So one way to prove that, should it get to that, is if a buyer says they plan on paying cash, well, then we need the proof of funds statement. We need to show that they can buy with cash. Now, again, what happens a lot of times is people say, I want to pay cash for the deal. And then they get into due diligence and they talk to maybe their wealth advisor or somebody, and their advisor is like, look, let's not do that. Let's do 50% cash and we'll do a conventional loan for the rest. So that's why they switch to a loan later after seeking some other advice. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't pay the cash and they just are choosing not to. So that's a different story. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. Just contact me if you've got any questions over that. All right. So filling out the rest of this, the buyer does or does not have to sell their other property. All right. So if they don't have to sell it, you just click does not there. If they do have to sell it, then you would click that one there and put in the property address, that it is under contract or it is not under contract, one of the two. And if it's not under contract, then is it listed? Is it listed by a licensed real estate broker? Buyers attempting to sell or lease the property without the assistance of a real estate broker. So put all those or check the right box there for that. And same thing here, like we talked about with cash. A lot of times, a buyer could purchase a home without selling their current home, but they don't want to do that. They want to sell their home in order to buy the other home. So, in a situation like that, a buyer could choose to go ahead and say the buyer does not have to sell their home as long as that's true. They could afford the second mortgage, the third mortgage, whatever. They could, but they know they don't want to do that, that they do have their home under contract and that it's, it seems like a solid deal to them. And if that does fall through, they still love this house. They would purchase it, and they would still have both mortgages. As long as that's the case, they could say they do not have to sell the other one. Again, this doesn't mean they don't want to sell that one first. Doesn't mean they can't back out in due diligence period. because something happened with that other loan. That could still be true, but you don't really have to disclose that to the seller side as long as you have the financial ability to actually close on the property. Okay, so that's how you'd fill those out. Property disclosure statements. The buyer has received it or the buyer has not received it on mineral oil rights and property disclosure statements, right? So usually you'll find that on the MLS sheet. You'll see the attachment right there. So I would highly suggest that you um, find that, put that part of the offer, have your buyer sign it, send it in, that you have received it. If you haven't received it yet, then be sure to check that right box. And then the third box is for those that are exempt. So the two main categories of exempt properties are brand new homes will be exempt from the property disclosure statement, and foreclosures. So if you're buying a bank-owned foreclosure, that'll be exempt as well for property disclosure statement. There's a few others in there, but generally those are the two that you'll maybe see. Okay, so check out the right boxes. So let's say in this case we do have them. They were attached to the MLS sheet. All right, moving on, page 7. Seller has owned the property for at least 1 year, less than 1 year, or does not yet own the property. You can see that in the MLS. It's now a piece of the MLS sheet. You should see whether they've owned it for a year or not. If you're not sure, again, just check off that they have owned it for more than a year. If it's not true, it's really up to the seller to change that and alert you to that. How can it be that they don't yet own the property? That's a question I get sometimes. Well, it's perfectly legal to flip a property where you don't yet own it, but you do have to disclose that. They are considering that a um, material fact, so you do have to disclose that you don't yet own the property, and so that's why that's there. But you could, in fact, go under contract with somebody saying, "Hey, look, I've got a deal where I'm buying this house at 180,000, but I'd be willing to sell it to you for 200,000 after I close on it." Maybe it's a really good deal. Maybe it's worth 250. I don't know. And they say, okay, yeah, I'll do that deal. That'd be a situation where you could do something like that. Okay. Lead-based paint. If it's before 1978, you need to have selected that box there that you do have the lead-based paint disclosure. Okay. Assessments. There are not any proposed special assessments. There are not any confirmed special assessments. Again, same thing. If you're like, well, I don't know, I haven't, you can ask the listing agent, but if you're not sure, well, typically we don't want any assessments on the property for our buyers, so I'm just going to select that there are not. And if the seller knows of some, they need to correct that and let us know. Okay. And then if there is a homeowners association, you need to select that, type in the homeowner association name, what the dues are, what the dues amount is per year, per month, per quarter, whatever it might be, and get all that information. Again, you can talk to the listing agent about that and usually get that information there. Okay? This is for if there is a secondary POA or HOA. All right, moving on to page 9, the deed. The deed will be typically should be exactly what is on page 1 for the buyer, Sally and Sam Jones. Okay, that's what the deed should be on this page. It doesn't have to be, but I say should be because if you're getting a loan, it's going to have to be correct. It's going to have to be the same as page 1. But talk to your lender. Maybe there's something that they could do for you on that end. But typically it needs to be the same. But it doesn't have to be. Let's just say the Jones family was buying it, but then they're going to deed it over to their daughter. And that's, I don't know, Sally Jr. Jones, whatever. So you could have the daughter listed here on the deed. But again, if you're getting a loan, typically the lender is going to want to make sure it's the same. Okay. So I forget the names again, Sally and Sam. Okay. All right. So it's, oops, sorry. Go back here just a minute. This would be like Sorry guys, it's a little slow. Sally and Sam Jones. Okay. All right, so that's what you're going to want there. Then this block here is for your closing costs. So the closing costs that you're asking the seller to pay for you. So maybe we're going to ask them to pay $4,000 in closing costs there, right? And that's where you would put that. And it's not your closing cost amount, but the amount that you're asking the seller to pay for. Typically, sellers don't mind paying the closing costs. It's just a matter of what their bottom line is. So in this case, we are offering $380,000, but we have $4,000 in closing costs. Well, that's really an offer of $376,000, right? So maybe they're listed at 380. Well, maybe that's a decent offer. But if somebody else came in with a higher offer at 380 but no closing costs, then you may lose out in that case. So it's all negotiable. Again, sellers don't usually mind paying it. It's just a matter of how much you're offering and all of that. So typically, if you're not asking for anything, you do need to put an NA or a 0 in there. I like to put 0 in that one. Makes more sense to me. And I'll put 0 closing costs there. All right, home warranty. Buyer is not asking for a home warranty to be provided from the seller, or maybe the buyer is. The buyer is going to obtain their own home warranty, or maybe the seller is already offering one. So let's say in this case, the seller is already offering one. All right, so seller has obtained and will provide a 1-year home warranty from, let's say, Home Warranty Inc. All right, at a cost of, let's just say it was $550, like that. All right, so maybe if that was the case, seller was already offering that, then that's how you would put that in there. But if the buyer wanted to pick their own, they would check that box and put that amount in there. Okay. Double check the amounts with your home warranty company because there are taxes now in North Carolina on those. So you want to double check with your home warranty company and get the exact amount to put in there. All right. Possession. If there is a possession before closing from the buyer or possession from the seller after closing, then that would need to be here. If there are tenants involved and the buyer is buying the property, but there's a lease already in place, that's when you need to check that. The possession is subject to the rights of the tenants. Okay. Typically, we don't want to use possession before or after closing. It creates some legal issues that are tough to get around. So we have the forms for that right here if we need to do that, but it can only be for a maximum of 14 days. Any more than that, you need an attorney involved and you need a lease agreement involved. So just talk to me if we get into those situations, but that's where you would check those off. It's important that we check off the right boxes here for any addendum. Essentially, if you don't check these boxes, then they're not part of the contract. So it doesn't matter if you have an additional provisions addendum signed. If it's not checked off here, it's really not part of the contract. So be careful with that. Make sure we have the correct things initialed and checked off here. Okay. So let's say in this case, let's just say there's an FHA VA addendum that we were using in this one, then we would check that one off there. Okay. Now the other addenda, you cannot write any other addenda or anything like that, so it has to be drafted by one of the buyers or sellers or another attorney, but not you, okay? But we do have some, like the regional acknowledgement disclosure, and my computer is slow on this system here. All right. Regional acknowledgement disclosure. That's one that we'll have signed on almost every deal, so maybe that would be in there like that. All right. Moving on, pretty much all set now. Page 10, page 11. The bottom is page 10, page 11 doesn't really have anything to fill out. Page 12 here, always point out the wire fraud warning to your buyers and sellers. Make sure they understand that. And then your buyer and seller would sign here. You only have them sign here if it is an entity. I have seen some contracts where the buyers sign here and then they sign again here for some reason. Just don't do that. Make sure that doesn't happen. That's only if it's an entity where they sign there. Okay. And then the notice page, page 13 here, there is an initial at the bottom, like you see here. The important note here is do not fill in the buyer notice address, seller notice address. I don't want that filled in, okay? It's too big of a problem when buyer and seller have each other's contact information. It could start off harmless and happy, and then all of a sudden it gets nasty. So I don't like them having each other's email addresses, so I'd choose to leave that off if at all possible. However, do fill out the confirmation of agency notice for both listing agent and selling agent. Okay, fill in the whole thing. All right, so the way this would look on our side, let's say we're the buyer's agent here, be Weichert Realtors Unlimited. That, and say we're the buyer's agent. Obviously, if the listing agent was with our firm, we would check dual agent. So in this case, that's not true. Firm license number is C17887. The address 802 Fairview Road, Suite 3000. Nashville 28803. Okay. We put our agent name. Okay. And then you always have to put in your license number. It's a rule. My deal is with my computer here, but that's the rule. You got to fill in the license number there. You do need to fill in your phone numbers as well. The reason is this is the notice, a confirmation of agency notice address. What that means is these are the correct ways that someone can contact you. So technically, if you don't have a notice address in here, it can create a problem for your client during the transaction with the other agent. All right, so make sure we have this all filled in correctly. Our fax number here is 828-333-5534. And then always fill in the listing firm side as well, okay? You can always find that in the MLS. You can find their firm license number, their current license number as well. You'll find that on the MLS sheet, so that'll be easy to find and fill out, okay? And then simply, again, the initials here, and then the last page is just the receipt of money. So none of this needs to be signed when you're writing the offer. We're not signing any of this. This is just when the listing agent gets the due diligence money, the seller gets the due diligence money, then they would sign here. The only thing you need to fill out is the seller name, buyer name, and property address up here, okay? So that's it for filling out the blanks on the offer to purchase 2T. Again, there's a lot of negotiation points throughout that form that we haven't hit on during this course, but we'll go over that in other courses and talk about the leverage points involved. But all those different blanks in there are what you do need to fill out, and all of them have to be filled out with something. Don't leave it blank. Don't leave something blank. Put an NA or not applicable in there if you're not filling it out. Okay. So I hope that's helpful, and talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye bye.